Right now you are likely sitting or lying in the dark, experiencing a heavy, flat sensation, a quiet, deep-seated cynicism that makes your chest feel like a parched plot of land. It is the specific ache of realizing you have stopped weeping, stopped feeling deeply, and stopped expecting anything beautiful or genuine from the world around you. You have been hardened by repeated betrayals, small disappointments, and the sheer exhaustion of navigating an indifferent environment. To protect your soft, vulnerable parts, your mind has built a thick, crusty layer of emotional numbness, a defensive armor that makes you feel safe from further injury, but terribly lonely inside its cold perimeter. You watch others care, laugh, or weep, and you feel like a detached ghost, wondering if your inner well has simply gone bitter and dry forever, leaving you incapable of true warmth. Let the room around you settle into its authentic nighttime state without your interference. The air entering the space carries the sharp, cold scent of frost on wood, a crisp winter dampness that cools the edges of your mattress. There is a low, rhythmic hum from the house settling, a steady vibration that demands nothing from your attention. The shadow on the ceiling remains dark and unmoving, a thick slate that covers the room and absorbs the lingering friction of your day. You can feel the exact points where the flat support beneath you cradles your heels, the backs of your calves, and the heavy baseline of your skull. There is no need to smooth your clothing or straighten the sheets. The darkness accepts you exactly as you are, irregular, exhausted, and shielded from the world. Right now, you are safe enough to soften. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, nor do you need to figure out how to dismantle this cold armor before tomorrow morning. What you are feeling in this moment is not failure, and it is certainly not proof that you are fundamentally broken or defective. It is simply the natural, intelligent consequence of a human heart that has been exposed to too many harsh winters without enough shelter. Tonight, we will not force the mind to be silent, nor will we aggressively demand that you feel joy or compassion. We are simply going to let the temperature of this space drop, allowing the hard crust around your chest to sit without judgment. The mind does not find its way back to warmth by fighting the cold or by forcing itself to feel things that are not there. It finds peace through a surprising Buddhist paradox. The very bitterness you despise, the numbness that scares you, is actually a layer of protection that your heart created out of a deep desire to survive. Beneath that white, mineral crust of cynicism runs an ancient, unpolluted spring of sweet water that has never been stained, dried out, or corrupted by a single thing that has happened to you. Your capacity for wonder and connection. It has merely gone underground, waiting for the defensive minerals to dissolve in their own time. Maybe you have felt this too, this quiet panic, that if you drop your cynicism, if you allow yourself to trust or feel deeply again, you will immediately be broken apart by the next disappointment. It feels safer to stay flat, to look at life through a cold pane of glass, and to assume that everything will eventually fail. We carry this protective freeze directly into our muscles, clamping the tissue around the heart, locking the back of the neck, and holding our breath as if we are still bracing against an incoming blow. If it feels right, take a slow breath and simply notice the dry, rigid quality of that internal freeze right now. You do not need to force anything to thaw. Just observe the density of the barrier you have carried through the day. Nothing is required of you now. The heavy materials you used to fortify your defenses, today, the sarcastic remarks, the emotional distance, the analytical skepticism, can be dropped like heavy iron tools into the cold grass outside. Think of a deep, subterranean stream moving silently through the limestone beds. Far below a frozen mountain ridge, the wind above may be howling. The topsoil may be packed with bitter frost, and the trees may be snapping from the ice. But down in the dark earth, the water remains fluid, cool, and perfectly sweet. It does not fight the frost on the surface. It simply stays true to its own flowing nature, protected by the massive density of the mountain itself. We spend years treating our numbness as a permanent curse, believing that because we cannot feel warmth today, we have lost our humanity forever. We try to scrub the bitterness away with shame, punishing ourselves for being cold, which only makes the protective crust grow thicker and more impenetrable. What if the healing you are searching for begins by recognizing that the crust is not you? It is just the salt left behind by old tears that had no place to fall. In a moment, our awareness will travel toward a dark, low-ceilinged earth hut near a salt-encrusted marsh, where an old hermit spends his days boiling bitter pine needles over a slow willow wood fire. This story will show us a path that does not require you to force your heart open by strength. But before we go there, let your internal armor melt back into the dark earth beneath your bed. Let the cool air find the dry, tight spaces within your chest without any expectation of a result. You have finally stopped running from your own deep springs, and for tonight, that is more than enough. High on the northern flank of the mountain, where a salt-encrusted marsh bled into the freezing rock pools, lived an old hermit named Master Ren. He inhabited a dark, low-ceilinged earth hut that smelled constantly of damp moss, willowwood smoke, and the heavy mineral tang of the nearby flats. Master Ren had once been a prominent court magistrate in the southern provinces, a man whose duty required him to sit through endless trials of human cruelty, greed, and broken oaths. When his own family was betrayed by a close ally, a cold glaze had settled over his world, and he simply walked away from the courts forever. He did not retreat to the mountain to find enlightenment, but rather to find a silence that matched the flat, frozen landscape within his own chest. Decades of living where the freezing mountain air met, the hot mineral springs had taught him how to read the slow, silent language of earth and water. To this lonely marsh came a man named Koi. Koi had spent his youth as a provincial tax collector, a profession that forced him to look into the desperate, calculating eyes of people who lied to protect their grain. Year after year, Koi witnessed the worst parts of human nature, the minor thievery, the false tears of merchants, and the absolute indifference of landlords toward the starving peasants. At first, his heart had ached with a sharp, active sorrow, but as the winters piled up, something inside him changed. The sorrow calcified into a thick, dull cynicism. He stopped expecting truth from anyone. He stopped looking people in the eye, and he found that he could no longer weep, even when his own sister passed away during the great autumn fever. He felt as though a layer of white, bitter salt had dried over his veins, making him entirely numb to the world. He was safe from being fooled, but he felt like a hollow shell walking through a dead landscape. On a late afternoon, when the sky was the color of bruised slate Koi entered the earth hut. Master Ren was sitting on a low stool before a small clay brazier, watching a simple iron pot filled with water and crushed bitter green pine needles. The old man did not offer a cup of tea or a word of welcome. He merely glanced at Koji's dull, vacant eyes and reached into the shadows behind his stool. He pulled out a heavy, thick-rimmed, charred clay bowl that had been completely blackened by decades of willow wood smoke. He placed it firmly on the rough wooden bench between them. Koi looked down into the bowl. It did not contain clear water or precious medicine. It was filled to the brim with coarse, grey salt crystals, clumped together in a hard, uneven mass that looked like dried frost. Master Ren picked up a handful of the dry pine needles from the floor and dropped them onto the salt. He asked the younger man if he could taste the sweetness of the mountain spring that fed the marsh outside the door. Koi shook his head, his voice flat and raspy. He replied that there was no sweetness out there, only the bitter brine of the flats and the freezing wind that killed the grass. He stated that his own life was exactly like the marsh, crusted over with minerals, useless and incapable of ever holding soft water again. He confessed that he felt nothing but a heavy, unmoving coldness where his heart used to be. The old hermit did not contradict him. Instead, he took a rough wooden ladle, dipped it into the iron pot of boiling pine needles, and poured a small splash of the steaming green liquid directly over the hard mass of grey salt crystals inside the charred clay bowl. The water hissed sharply as it struck the mineral surface, sending up a thin plume of vapour that smelled intensely of bitter resin and wet earth. Koi watched, expecting the water to simply sit on top of the hard crust or overflow the rim of the bowl. But as the heat of the liquid penetrated the grey crystals, a slow, quiet change began to take place. The hard, jagged edges of the salt did not break apart with a loud snap. They began to soften, losing their sharp geometry under the influence of the warmth. The white crust slowly turned into a fluid grey slush, and then, with an almost imperceptible movement, the solid mass dissolved entirely into the water, disappearing until the liquid in the bowl was dark, deep, and perfectly uniform. Master Ren reached out and pushed the charred clay bowl closer to Koji's chest. He told the young man to dip his index finger into the liquid and taste what remained. Koi hesitated, then lowered his finger into the warm, dark water. He touched the liquid to his tongue. It was incredibly salty, biting, and bitter from the pine needles, a flavor that carried the exact texture of all the grief, betrayal, and numbness he had accumulated over his years in the lowlands. But beneath that immediate sharp burn, at the very back of his throat, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of something else. It was a faint, cool sweetness, a mineral-rich purity that belonged to the deep volcanic spring running miles beneath the mountain, entirely separate from the salt flats on the surface. Koi looked at the bowl, then at the old man's weathered face, and suddenly, a strange, terrifying looseness occurred in the center of his chest. He realized that the salt had never destroyed the water. The water had simply been holding the salt, allowing it to take up all the space, until there was no room left for anything else to move. The bitterness was not the essence of the bowl. It was just a passenger that had dissolved into the fluid core. For the first time in 10 winters, Koi felt a hot, prickling sensation behind his eyelids. He did not try to blink it away, nor did he try to analyze why his throat was tightening. He simply sat in the dim light of the earth hut, his finger resting on the warm rim of the charred clay bowl. while two slow, heavy tears finally broke through the dry skin of his cheeks, falling silently into the dark water below. The silence of the mountain ridge seemed to expand around him, wrapping his long-held cynicism in a heavy, safe blanket of moss. And for the first time since his youth, the necessity to stay frozen simply melted away into the earth floor. This encounter in the earth hut is not an instruction to seal yourself away from life, nor does it imply that the correct spiritual path requires you to become an unfeeling glacier. It is not an invitation to construct a detached, unmoving wall between your heart and the world outside. Instead, it reveals a much subtler truth about the landscape of human weariness. The deep numbness you experience when you look back at your history is not an indication that your capacity to care has been permanently extinguished. The true suffering did not originate solely from the cold actions of those who broke your trust or from the bleak environments you had to navigate just to survive. The heaviest ache stems from the specific way your own mind began to hold those memories, crystallizing them into a permanent, icy filter through which you view every incoming dawn. Ancient Buddhist insight helps us see that when we use cynicism as our primary shield, we are trying to protect ourselves by drinking the very brine we fear, the tight, desperate contraction that says, if I can just assume everyone has a hidden motive, if I can just stop expecting kindness entirely, then I can never be crushed again. That is the exact mechanism that turns a temporary season of disappointment into a lifelong inner winter. We become just like the tax collector, mistaking the layer of dried salt on our skin for the true texture of our flesh. We inflict a secondary injury upon our own nature. The first injury is the undeniable reality that life can be deeply unfair, cold, and deceptive. The secondary injury, the one we quietly maintain every night, is the belief that our heart must become equally cold to survive the journey. What if you allowed that protective layer to simply be there without trying to violently hack it away? True mindfulness, when brought down into the heavy reality of your modern evening, is simply the gentle capacity to observe that your heart has gone into hiding. It is the ability to feel the exact point where your chest hardens when a memory rises, without judging yourself for being self-protective. You merely notice the freeze. You watch the cynical thought glide through your mind like a grey bird over a salt marsh, recognizing that it is trying to protect you from an old ghost, but that it does not speak for the depth of who you are. Modern awareness is the spacious, warm room that can hold both the bitter frost of your thoughts and the quiet current of life moving beneath them. It is the realization that your defensive armor is a passing cloud, not the sky itself. We frequently mistake the act of letting go with a form of weak surrender, as though we are being asked to pretend that our wounds did not happen, or that the people who hurt us were justified. But true release is an act of immense internal dignity. It is the decision to stop using your own precious energy to keep an old betrayal alive. When you stop demanding that a past situation change its shape before you are allowed to be happy, you are not giving up. You are simply choosing to stop pouring fresh water into a well that has been filled with salt. You are letting the sediment settle to the bottom, allowing your awareness to drop down into the deeper, unpolluted currents that have stayed perfectly fluid beneath your longest grievances. Consider how much vitality is consumed by maintaining a state of constant, vigilant skepticism. It is like carrying a blackened, heavy vessel of old brine everywhere you go, constantly checking the rim, terrified that if you let your guard down for a single afternoon, you will be poisoned again. The wisdom of the Buddha points toward an extraordinary emotional liberation. The cynical identity you have built to navigate the world is not a permanent fixture of your soul. It is a behavioral garment woven out of old winters. It shifts and changes with every passing interaction, crumbling into dust the moment you encounter an unexpected act of genuine kindness. Impermanence is the quietest reassurance for an exhausted heart. It means that the numbness you feel right now, the flat indifference that frightens you, is completely incapable of lasting forever. The hard crust of your cynicism is not made of stone. It is made of minerals that are entirely soluble in the presence of warmth. The freezing weather that forced your heart to go underground is just a passing cycle in the massive, shifting geography of your life. It cannot lock away your capacity for warmth indefinitely, because the warmth does not come from what happens on the surface. It bubbles up from an inexhaustible, subterranean source that was born long before your first disappointment. True compassion begins when you look at your own defensive coldness and stop treating it as a moral failure. It is the strength to meet your numbness, your sharp words, and your total lack of faith with a soft, non-judgmental embrace. It means recognizing that the inner skeptic is just a deeply frightened child who has been standing watch at the gate for far too long, shivering in the wind, trying to keep out the wolves. You do not need to scold the gatekeeper tonight. You do not need to force him to open the heavy doors before you are ready. You only need to build a small, quiet fire inside the courtyard and invite him to sit down by the embers. In a short while, this narrative will bring the warmth of the earth hut directly into the physical reality of your own body, moving into a soft internal practice where we can allow these hard mineral deposits to dissolve together. But for now, let these reflections rest within your mind, like a ladle of warm water poured over frozen ground. There is no requirement for you to analyze or memorize these concepts. The teaching is not a test you must pass to be worthy of comfort. It is simply a reminder of the soft water that is already running beneath your feet, and a gentle promise that the earth beneath your mattress is perfectly ready to hold your weight while you wait for the thaw to arrive. If it feels right, let your attention drift away from the echo of these words and slide directly into the immediate physical experience of your breathing. Perhaps you can observe the quiet, cool sensation at the back of your throat as the air enters your nostrils, and the slow, heavy warmth that spreads across your chest as you let the breath slip back out into the room. There is absolutely no need to force a deeper rhythm or to change the way your ribs expand. You are not trying to reach a state of perfect stillness, nor are you being evaluated on how well you can quiet your thoughts tonight. Even noticing that your breath feels tight, short, or frozen is entirely enough. Let each cycle of air arrive on its own timeline, like water bubbling up through a soft bed of earth beneath the frost. As you remain there, you might choose to invite the small, hard muscle groups of your body to let go of the day's posture. Perhaps you can allow your tongue to drop away from the roof of your mouth, softening the hidden hinge where your jaw connects to your skull. Notice the tiny muscles around your eyes, the ones that spent hours narrowing against the world, analyzing intentions and holding up a flat, defensive mask. Let those tissues widen and smooth out, as if the cool vapor of a natural hot spring is passing gently over your forehead. If you find a stubborn pocket of rigidity in your shoulders or the small of your back, see if you can let those points sink a fraction of an inch deeper into the flat mattress beneath you. You are giving your physical frame permission to step out of its armor, recognizing that in this room, there is no longer anything you need to guard against. Now, see if you can isolate one specific thought or memory from your recent past that has been making you feel particularly detached or cynical. It might be a sharp phrase someone used that felt like a betrayal, the memory of a situation where your kindness was taken for granted, or simply the heavy, flat exhaustion of feeling like nothing you do will ever change your circumstances. Do not try to push this thought away or replace it with an artificial image of light. Instead, give the pattern a quiet, honest name within your own mind. You might say to yourself, "This is the freeze of old disappointment," or "This is the protective crust keeping me safe." By simply observing the pattern without judgment, you are stepping out of the role of the cold skeptic and becoming the quiet hermit who watches the steam rise from the iron pot. In your mind's eye, if it feels comfortable, imagine that this precise emotional numbness or bitter worry is a hard mass of grey salt crystals resting inside a heavy, thick-rimmed, charred clay bowl. The vessel is dark, blackened by the wood smoke of old grievances, and the mineral crust within feels dry, jagged, and entirely unyielding to the touch. You do not need to struggle to break these crystals with your fingers, and you do not need to blame yourself for how thick the layer has become over the winters. Instead, picture yourself simply resting your palms against the cold, rough exterior of that clay bowl, allowing its density to be exactly as it is without trying to alter its shape. Perhaps, as you watch that solid mass, you can imagine a gentle, unhurried shift in the temperature of the scene. Picture a slow splash of warm, dark spring water being poured directly over the center of the grey crystals. Watch as the immediate hiss of steam rises up, carrying the scent of bitter pine resin into the dark air. Notice how the sharp, jagged edges of the salt do not break violently. They simply begin to soften and round out under the influence of the warmth. The white crust slowly turns to a soft, fluid, grey slush, and then, with an almost imperceptible movement, dissolves entirely into the dark liquid, disappearing until the contents of the bowl are perfectly fluid, deep, and uniform. The bitterness has not vanished from the universe, but it has lost its hard, frozen edge, becoming part of a current that is free to flow. You can allow this image to slowly dissolve now, returning your awareness completely to the heavy sensation of your body pressing against the bed. There is no requirement for you to feel entirely healed or perfectly warm in this moment. Transforming a long-held habit of self-protection does not occur through a sudden dramatic explosion. It through these tiny, quiet moments of allowing the frost to sit in the presence of warmth. You can return to this soft, inner practice whenever you are ready. But for tonight, your exploration is complete. Let the air continue to pass through your chest like a cool wind over a sheltered valley. You are no longer required to freeze your heart to survive the night. For the remaining hours of this evening, you can simply rest as the fluid water itself, running safely beneath the massive weight of the mountain, entirely whole in the darkness. When the final mountain storms of the season arrived, turning the limestone cliffs into sheets of black glass. Koei discovered that his ancient defense mechanism had not vanished into thin air. Letting his tears fall into the charred clay bowl had been a profound moment of softening. But a lifetime of suspicion does not evaporate after a single night by the brazier. A wandering merchant came through the mountain pass, seeking shelter from the driving sleet. Over a bowl of coarse barley, the merchant casually related a piece of news from Koji's old provincial town. The very landlord who had skimmed the grain tax and blamed the local peasants had just been elevated to a high administrative post in the capital, rewarded with wealth and titles for his deceit. The moment the words left the merchant's mouth, a familiar, blinding heat surged up from Koji's stomach and settled in his jaw. The old, cynical voice inside his head began to scream with an absolute, venomous certainty, whispering that human beings were fundamentally corrupt, that justice was an elaborate lie designed for fools, and that his brief attempt to soften his heart had been nothing but a weak, pathetic mistake. He felt a desperate urge to pack his meager belongings, leave the mountain, and return to his old habits of cold, defensive isolation, where no one could ever make a fool of him again. The small sprout of warmth he had felt in the earth hut seemed completely crushed by the reality of an indifferent world. The following dawn, seeing the rigid, dark line of Koji's shoulders, Master Ren instructed him to carry a heavy bundle of dry willow wood up to a narrow, sheltered limestone hollow on the northern face of the mountain. In this hidden crevice lived an old nun named Sister Tam, who lived alone, tending to a tiny grove of wild winter plums. When Koei reached the hollow, the wind was biting, carrying the scent of raw frost and dead pine needles. He found Sister Tam, kneeling in the black, frozen soil, her hands wrapped around the base of a small, ancient plum tree whose dark branches were just beginning to push out tiny, fragile white blossoms. A severe midnight frost had coated the roots in a thick, crystalline shell of white mineral crust, choking the trunk where it met the earth. The tree was suffocating under the weight of the ice, its delicate buds drooping toward the cold stone. Sister Tam was not weeping, nor was she striking the frozen soil in anger. She was holding a blunt iron stirring rod with a simple uncarved pine handle, using it to clear away the buildup of mineral salt and frozen silt that had accumulated around a small natural hot spring that ran through the limestone directly beneath the tree's roots. Koei, eager to distract his mind from the bitter news of the landlord, dropped his wood and grabbed a heavy iron spade. He began to hack at the frozen earth around the plum tree with a frantic, aggressive intensity. He wanted to break the ice by force, to shatter the crystalline crust that was choking the blossoms, feeling a surge of righteous anger against the cold weather itself. But every time his iron spade struck the frozen soil, the vibration shuddered up through the handle, bruising his palms and jarring his elbows, while the hard mineral crust remained completely unbroken, merely shedding a few white flakes. He grew increasingly breathless, his knuckles bleeding from the cold grit, his mind replaying the image of the corrupt landlord living in luxury, while this innocent tree died. In the mud, Sister Tam reached out and gently laid her hand over the uncarved pine handle of his spade, stopping his descent. She looked at his wild, angry eyes and shook her head. She softly remarked that the frost cannot be defeated by an iron blade, and the bitterness of the winter cannot be broken by a matching bitterness in the arms. She pointed down toward the small fissure in the limestone, where the blunt iron stirring rod was wedged. She explained, that the tree did not survive the great winter by fighting the frost on its branches. It survived because deep beneath the frozen topsoil, its roots remained wrapped around the warm, hidden veins of the mountain spring. She guided his hand to the blunt, iron-stirring rod. Instead of telling him to strike the earth, she asked him to simply hold the iron rod steady within the limestone crack, allowing the deep, hot water from the subterranean spring to pool around the metal. Koi knelt in the mud, his chest heaving, his mind still spinning with cynical justifications. He gripped the iron handle, expecting nothing. For several minutes, there was only the sound of the freezing wind whistling through the limestone cleft and the cold scraping of his own boots on the rock. And then, as he held the rod still, he felt a strange, subtle warmth travel up through the cold iron, vibrating directly into the calloused skin of his palm. The hot water from the deep volcanic vein was rising through the fissure, bubbling softly against the base of the iron rod. Sister Tam did not move. She simply knelt beside him, her old hands resting on the frozen bark of the plum tree, waiting with an immense, unhurried patience. Koi looked at the thick, white, mineral crust choking the base of the trunk. Under the steady, gentle warmth of the rising water, the ice did not shatter with a dramatic explosion. It began to weep. The hard, jagged crystals of salt and frost slowly softened, turning into clear, heavy drops that trickled down into the black soil. The dark bark of the tree appeared from beneath the white shroud, wet, alive, and dense with life. In that quiet moment, as a single white plum petal detached itself from a branch and fell softly into the muddy water, a profound transformation occurred within Koji's mind. He noticed the angry, cynical thoughts still circling his head like crows. The thoughts about the landlord, the injustice of the town, the cruelty of men. But for the first time in his life, he did not treat those thoughts as an absolute command to freeze. He did not pick up his spade to strike the world again. He took a slow, deep breath of the freezing mountain air, letting his chest expand, and simply sat with the uncertainty of the thawing earth. He realized that the landlord's corruption was just another layer of heavy frost on the surface of the lowlands, a bitter, defensive crust built out of fear and greed. It could not touch the deep, unpolluted spring of humanity that ran through the roots of the mountain. Koi reached down into the muddy pool, picked up a handful of the wet, thawed black soil, and gently pressed it around the exposed roots of the plum tree, protecting it from the coming night. He did not forgive the landlord, nor did he pretend the injustice had not happened. But as he wiped the cold mud from his fingers onto his wool robe, he felt the heavy, suffocating necessity to be cynical simply slip from his shoulders. He had chosen to keep his roots connected to the warm water below, allowing the world to be cold while choosing, in his own small way, to remain fluid. When we look at the young man kneeling in the black mud of the limestone hollow, choosing to hold the iron rod steady rather than striking the frozen ground, we are looking directly at the dismantling of an ancient psychological trap. The human mind possesses a deeply grooved habit of believing that if it can only remain hard enough, cynical enough, and suspicious enough, it can somehow control the unpredictable weather of existence. We use our bitterness as a kind of preemptive strike against reality, convinced that if we never expect warmth, we can never be wounded by the frost. We spend our nights replaying old betrayals, reviewing the list of people who failed to see our value, and meticulously rehearsing every possible future disappointment so that nothing can catch us off guard. But this constant internal bracing is like wrapping your own roots in ice, hoping it will protect you from a winter that has already arrived. The profound wisdom of the Buddha cuts straight through this exhausting loop by separating our experiences into two distinct kinds of discomfort. The first pain is the raw, unpolished reality that life inevitably brings to our door. The sudden change in a relationship, the corrupt choice of an authority figure, the loss of someone we loved, or the simple physical fatigue of an aging body. This first layer is like the fierce frost that coats the mountain plum trees on a dark winter dawn. It is cold, it is indifferent, and it cares nothing for our plans or our desires. We cannot command the weather of the lowlands to change, and we cannot force every person we meet to possess an honest or compassionate heart. But the real suffering, the heavy, flat numbness that keeps you staring at your ceiling at 3 a.m, is the second pain. The second pain is entirely what the mind manufactures out of its own resistance. It is the elaborate toxic narrative we construct around the cold event. When someone treats us with cold indifference, the first pain is a passing moment of grief. The second pain is our own mind rising up to claim that the world is an inherently broken place, that we were fools for ever opening our doors, and that we must now freeze our feelings solid to ensure we are never vulnerable again. We take a single patch of frost and turn it into a permanent identity, building a thick, white mineral crust around our entire chest, until our inner well runs completely bitter and dry. We often try to resolve this inner numbness by using self-judgment, believing that if we blame ourselves for being too soft in the past, we will successfully harden our defenses for the future. But trying to heal a cold heart with shame is like striking frozen mud with an iron spade, expecting it to turn into a soft garden bed. The harder you strike, the more the shock waves jar your own bones, leaving you feeling more fragile, more isolated, and more deeply estranged from your own natural warmth. True peace does not require you to live in a world where no one ever lies, or where every winter is mild. It does not promise that your mind will instantly stop producing cynical thoughts when you are hurt. Peace is simply a different relationship with that frost. Consider how the old nun did not spend her energy screaming at the sky or trying to chop down the winter plum tree because it was covered in ice. She simply cleared a small path for the underground, hot spring to do its work, trusting that the inherent warmth of the mountain was much more powerful than the temporary freeze on the surface. When you practice this form of radical presence within your own heart, you stop treating your cynical thoughts as absolute truths that you must obey or defend. You notice the inner skeptic rising up to fortify the gates, and instead of helping him pile up the stones, you look at him with a spacious, soft awareness. You recognize that his coldness is not a sign that you are defective. It is just a sign that you were hurt and that you are tired of shivering. This simple shift entirely changes the economy of your suffering. When you stop pouring your energy into the story of your bitterness, the first pain begins to lose its suffocating grip. A disappointment becomes just a passing rainstorm over the ridge, not a permanent verdict on the futility of human life. The uncertainty of tomorrow ceases to be a monster waiting to crush you. It becomes like the unworked wood of the stirring rod, a space where you can rest without needing to carve out a guaranteed outcome. You no longer need to freeze yourself to remain safe from the lowlands. By allowing the wobbly, irregular parts of your history to sit in the presence of your own non-judgmental attention, you discover an unshakable inner gravity that does not depend on the weather of the capital. You realize that you can let the world be cold and you can still let your own deep springs flow. Now, let this quiet mountain thawing travel across the distance of time and find you right where you are, in the small, unrecorded corners of your contemporary daily life. This medicine is not meant to be left on the cold ridges or inside the dark earth huts of memory. It is designed specifically for the moments you spend lying awake in a quiet bedroom, watching the digital clock roll forward while your mind frantically replays a perceived social blunder or an unfinished argument from 3 years ago. It is for those draining afternoons at work, when you catch yourself repeatedly checking your screen for a specific notification or message, desperately seeking a brief drop of external reassurance to melt the heavy, cold silt that has settled behind your ribs. We practice this spaciousness whenever we find ourselves offering a hollow, mechanical smile to a colleague, while feeling completely detached and heavy inside, wondering if everyone else has received some secret map to fulfillment that we somehow missed. Think of how much internal labor you expend trying to control the shifting currents of your closest relationships, constantly scanning for signs of withdrawal, or silently comparing your own jagged, uncurved progress to the beautifully curated, seamless timelines of strangers online. A sharp glaze of inadequacy settles over your thoughts, whispering that you are fundamentally not enough, that you have fallen permanently behind, and that your only salvation is to work harder. Harden your gaze and never let anyone see how tired you truly are. But a single, unhurried breath taken tomorrow morning before you unlock your phone is a magnificent act of spiritual discipline. It is a moment of choosing the subterranean spring over the surface brine, when that familiar, frantic impulse floods your chest, the urge to explain away a mistake, to force an indifferent person, to validate your heart, or to feel deep guilt for wanting to rest. You can simply pause. You can remind yourself that not every cynical thought deserves your obedience, and not every fearful feeling is an absolute command to fortify the gates. You are entirely capable of caring for your life and the people in it, without gripping their responses so tightly that your spirit begins to freeze. True emotional density allows you to leave a difficult conversation or an unresolved text message exactly as it is, without needing to immediately shape it into a monument of personal failure. You can let the cold weather of another person's mood pass completely through the courtyard of your mind, while your own roots remain nestled deep within the warm, silent currents of your own sovereign being. Tomorrow, when the habit of cynical armor tempts you to withdraw or to offer a sharp, sarcastic defense, see if you can let your voice remain soft and plain. Let the genuine texture of your vulnerability show, just like the dark, wet bark of the plum tree when the mineral crust begins to weep. The resilience of your days does not come from pretending to be a flawless block of ice. It comes from allowing your soft water to find its own natural path through the rock. We have been taught by an aggressive, restless culture that we must earn our right to be still, that peace is a luxury reserved only for those who have chiseled away every human flaw and completed every task on an infinite horizon. But this is the ultimate illusion of the frozen mind. You are allowed to rest without earning it. The deep mountain springs do not apologize for flowing through the dark channels, and the winter blossoms do not ask permission from the frost before they push through the limestone fissures. When you lay down your head tonight, let the heavy, critical scripts of your performance drop into the dark mud like discarded iron spades. You do not have to settle the balance of your career or repair every fracture in your history before you are permitted to let your chest untighten. Tomorrow will inevitably present its own cold winds, its own calculating interactions, and its own hard minerals. But you will encounter those moments with a very different kind of internal gravity. You will understand that the warmth you were so desperately seeking from the external world was never waiting for you in the praise of a supervisor or the fickle attention of a companion. It has been running perfectly fluid within the deepest chambers of your own life all along, cool, sweet, and completely protected by the massive density of your own existence. You can step off the tread of constant self-protection. You can allow yourself to be clumsy, to be uncertain, and to be beautifully unpolished, knowing that your true nature was established long before the lowlands ever tried to weigh your worth. Let the modern hurry dissolve into the crisp night air of this room as we prepare to let the final lines of the story melt into the deepest pools of restorative sleep. The dark limestone hollow is falling into total stillness now, and the bitter midnight sleet has finally ceased its scratching against the northern face of the mountain. The wind has dropped to a low, distant whisper, passing softly through the empty plum branches without shaking loose a single white petal. Down below, the salt-encrusted marsh rests under a thick mantle of winter shadow, its frozen pools reflecting nothing but the deep, quiet velvet of an unclouded sky. All the sharp hiss of boiling resin, the cold scrape of iron spades, and the heavy grey mineral crusts of the lowlands have been completely absorbed by the damp, quiet earth. The blunt iron-stirring rod has been left in the deep limestone fissure, its uncarved pine handle cooling in the dark, entirely forgotten by the hands that held it so tightly during the day. Let your own internal pacing slow down to match the massive, unhurried density of the mountain depths. With each quiet breath that enters your body, you are sinking deeper into the soft security of your own bed, allowing your limbs to become as heavy and as motionless as ancient roots nestled far below the frost line. There is no longer an audience watching for your reaction in the corners of this room. The darkness has completely swallowed your history, your obligations, your skepticism, and the exhausting necessity to maintain a sharp, defensive armor against the world. You do not have to solve a single dilemma tonight, nor do you need to arrange your memories into a flawless pattern that proves you were right to be cautious. Your physical frame is becoming immensely heavy. Your breathing is becoming beautifully quiet, arriving and leaving, like the soft, warm vapor of a hidden spring, bubbling up through a bed of dark moss. Let the skin around your temples relax completely, letting go of the vigilant, scanning gaze that spent the day looking for signs of betrayal or deceit. Let the weight of your skull press deeply into the supportive surface beneath you, recognizing that the earth requires no justification before it accepts your shape. You are returning to the fluid, uncorrupted current that belonged to you before you ever learned to build a wall of salt around your heart. The sweet water running through your deepest self requires no validation from the lowlands, lands to be pure. And it requires no approval from the capital to keep its fluid warmth. It simply flows in the dark, dense, genuine, and immeasurably secure, protected by miles of solid mountain rock. You have full permission to stop managing your life for the remaining hours of this night. You have permission to be tired, to be uncertain, and to let your long-held cynicism melt back into the black soil without a single trace of guilt. The world can keep its winter, and the frost can freeze the surface without ever touching the source. Slide down completely into the subterranean pools of the evening, where the sediment settles to the bottom and the current becomes perfectly clear, deep, and still. You are safe enough to drop the iron spade. You are dense enough to let the warmth do its work. Let the dark night hold your entire weight without an explanation, as you drift far away from the frozen shoreline of your efforts and dissolve into the fluid, nameless sanctuary of the deep spring. And what if the gentle, open warmth you thought the world had stolen from you long ago was actually the very current that was carrying you through the winter, entirely untouched by the ice? Let your awareness settle even more deeply into the quiet space trailing after that question, allowing the words to sink like soft pine needles drifting down through a dark, unmoving pool of water. The analytical mind may still try to tread the perimeter of the old workshop, wondering how it will manage the fractured pieces of tomorrow's obligations. But each defensive thought is now nothing more than a pale, distant shadow rippling across a stone wall. You do not need to reach out and freeze the shadow in place. You do not need to check if the posture it holds is strong enough to ward off criticism. In the profound silence of the mountain night, the root does not ask the frozen topsoil for permission to remain warm. It simply holds its place in the dark earth, entirely content to let the world above go cold. Listen closely to the vast, spacious stillness that enters the room. When you finally stop demanding that your life prove its safety before you are allowed to rest, it is a dense, comforting quiet, the kind that fills an empty valley after the final winter gale has blown itself out over the jagged peaks, and the mountain air has grown perfectly clear and motionless under the stars. For so many years, you have treated your own heart like a fragile vessel that had to be continuously fortified with layers of suspicion, fear, and cynical skepticism to prevent it from being shattered by the indifference of others. You believed that if you permitted a single soft space to remain exposed, the world would find your vulnerability and drain you of your remaining vitality. But the old nun kneeling in the limestone crevice did not look for branches that had frozen into iron. She looked for the flexible tissue that still knew how to weep under the ice. Your long-held numbness is not a permanent defect that you must violently hack away through an endless cycle of self-punishment and forced positivity. It is simply the mineral residue left behind by a lifetime of surviving storms, without enough shelter, a protective crust that is completely soluble the moment you stop fighting its existence. When you stop trying to force your history into a perfectly straight, painless line, you finally give your spirit permission to inhabit the full, heavy depth of your own skin. You allow your breathing to drop down from the tight, vigilant chambers of the throat and expand into the quiet cavern of the abdomen, where the subterranean stream moves undisturbed by the rumors of the lowlands. There is no one left to convince in this darkness, no one to defend yourself against, and no nobler harder shape for you to achieve before you are permitted to let go. Let the entire image of the noisy marketplace and its calculating transactions fade from your view like a dying campfire on a distant ridge. The betrayals, the unreturned messages, the agonizing comparisons, and the constant pressure to pretend you are fine are all just light debris floating on the surface of a deep, unyielding mountain lake. They drift with the passing wind. They break apart against the rocks, and they possess absolutely no power to reach down into the cool, dark floor where your true substance resides. You can allow the surface of your life to be troubled by the weather. You can let the outer water ripple and freeze if it must. But down here, in the quiet sanctuary of your own being, nothing is moving. You are anchored by the simple, undeniable reality of your own existence. Fluid, nameless, and perfectly secure. Perhaps you can feel a subtle, spreading warmth beginning to occupy the center of your chest. A quiet reassurance that emerges only when the exhausted sentry finally steps down from the watchtower and sits by the cooling embers inside the wall. The gates are shut, the armor can be unbuckled, and the rigid, frozen mask can be laid aside on the grass. You do not have to be the vigilant protector who anticipates every incoming disappointment. Tonight, you can let the heavy timber of your defenses rest against the earth, trusting that the mountain is fully capable of holding your weight without your assistance. You can rest without a strategy, without an explanation, and without a single plan for how you will clear the frost when the sun returns. The breath continues its slow, rhythmic work, arriving like a cool mist through the dark pines and leaving like a soft shadow sliding across the limestone. With each quiet cycle of air, the remaining knots of tension in your body are being gently rinsed away, falling down into the dark, wet soil where they can no longer bind your muscles or constrict the flow of your heart. Your shoulders have become entirely heavy. Your jaw has dropped away from your teeth, and your hands are lying loose and open on the sheets, their fingers completely untightened, like dormant roots waiting for the spring. You have walked out of the tax collector's office for the final time tonight, and the silence that meets you is not emptiness. It is the immense, comforting fullness of a home you never truly left. Sleep is not a privilege that you must earn by completing your life perfectly or by solving every conflict before the lamps are extinguished. It is a natural right, a gentle returning of the water to the deep underground channels from which it first emerged. Let yourself roll back into that ancient, undisturbed earth, letting go of the need to be remembered, recognized, or understood by anyone on the other side of this night. You are allowed to be completely invisible for the next few hours. You are allowed to let your name and your struggles fall away until they are nothing more than a faint murmur carried off by the river current. As the dark water closes over the image of the winter plum, the mind loses its desire to project itself into the future or to seek guarantees from the coming days. The future is just another uncarved block of wood sitting out in the cold rain on a distant ridge, entirely beyond your reach until the light returns. For now, it is more than enough to simply be the weight that rests beneath the blankets, the quiet presence that requires no external validation to exist, and the silent heart that has finally stopped fighting its own natural gravity. Let yourself slide down into the deepest, heaviest pools of the evening, where the silt is perfectly still and the darkness is thick enough to hold you without a single word. And as the last trace of awareness dissolves into the soft shadow of the room, notice how the heavy armor of your cynicism no longer feels like a structure to be maintained, but like a handful of dry salt that has finally found the warm, deep spring and vanished into the sweet waters of the dark. Down here, where the salt has lost its shape and become one with the current, the very idea of a boundary begins to drift away into the dark. The mind has spent so many winters believing that it is the crust, that without that rigid, defensive shell, it would simply wash away into nothingness, leaving no trace behind. But the water does not lose its identity when the ice melts. It only reclaims its freedom to move, to sink, and to find the lowest, most peaceful places in the earth. You have spent so much energy keeping your feelings frozen to avoid the pain of being broken, yet the water can never be broken by a hammer, and the deep spring can never be fractured by an iron blade. It simply parts around the blow, absorbs the impact in its silent depths, and continues to flow toward its home. Let the lingering echoes of your modern struggles, the unfinished projects, the unreturned messages, and the constant, nagging whisper that you are falling behind sink like heavy stones into the deep mud of the lake bed. You do not have to dredge them up tonight, and you do not have to figure out how you will face them when the morning light touches the window. The world will continue to spin, the lowlands will continue to hurry, and the people who do not possess the capacity to see you will continue to act from their own frozen places. None of that requires your attention right now. Your only assignment for the remaining hours of this night is to allow the weight of your body to be completely taken by the mattress, letting go of the exhausting illusion that you are the one who must keep the mountain from falling. Think of how much vitality is restored when you finally stop trying to fix your life through the lens of self-judgment. We carry our mistakes around like bags of dry brine, constantly pouring them over our fresh aspirations, wondering why our inner landscape feels so barren and parched. But the wisdom of the Buddha is not a demand for you to become a flawless, saintly figure who never experiences anger or doubt. It is simply an invitation to stop striking the frozen earth. It is the realization that beneath the bitterest layer of your cynicism, the sweet, unpolluted water of your core humanity is already running, perfectly intact, waiting only for you to stop adding new ice to the surface. You do not need to manufacture warmth. You only need to sit by the small fire of your own bare awareness and let the natural temperature of your being do the rest. The room around you has become a vast, protective sanctuary, a dark limestone vault that shields you from the biting winds of public opinion and the harsh glare of comparison. The silence here is not a hollow vacuum. It is the thick, comfort density of an ancient forest after a heavy snowfall, where every sound is muffled and every sharp edge is smoothed over by a soft, white blanket. You can feel the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of your abdomen, a slow tide that moves without any conscious effort on your part, proving that life is fully capable of sustaining you even when you have completely abandoned the controls. With each breath that leaves your lips, imagine the remaining white crystals of defensive salt around your chest dissolving into clear, warm drops, trickling down through the sheets and vanishing into the dark ground below. You are safe enough to let the gatekeeper rest. The tired, shivering soldier who has spent years standing watch at the perimeter of your heart can finally lay down his shield step inside the small earth hut and close his eyes by the embers of the willow wood fire. There are no wolves left to fight in this room, and there is no treasure left for anyone to steal, because the true gold of your nature is hidden so deeply within the mineral veins of the mountain that no external hand can ever reach it. You can let the world think what it wants. You can let the town talk and the land barons claim their false victories, while you remain heavy, undisturbed, and sovereign within the dark majesty of your own internal space. As you drift closer to the absolute edge of sleep, let the image of the wild winter plum tree settle into your chest like an old familiar map. Its branches may be bare, its buds may be small, and the soil around its base may still carry the damp chill of the passing storm, but its roots are wrapped securely around the hot, subterranean veins of the earth, drawing up an invisible, inexhaustible nourishment that ensures its survival. You are that tree. Your resilience does not depend on the mildness of the weather or the approval of the passerby. It comes from your willingness to let your awareness drop beneath the frozen topsoil of your thoughts and rest in the hot, fluid core of your own breathing life. The last thoughts are beginning to lose their calligraphy, blurring into soft, grey shapes that float like winter mist through the mountain passes. The words themselves are turning to simple, comforting vibrations, a low lullaby of running water and shifting stone that gently nudges your spirit down into the deepest, darkest hollows of the night. There are no more insights to integrate, no more stories to remember, and no more self-protection to maintain. The tools have been dropped, the salt has melted, and the water has found its way back to the silence of the underground channels, where it requires no light to know its own way home. Let yourself go entirely into that nameless depth, sinking down past the memory of your name, past the history of your wounds, and past every definition the world has ever tried to carve onto your face. You are no longer the tax collector. You are no longer the magistrate. And you are no longer the performer trying to buy a moment of safety with a false smile. You are simply the quiet, heavy presence that breathes in the dark, an uncarved piece of the mountain, resting in absolute peace while the frost covers the earth far above. Sleep is yours tonight, unearned, unconditional, and as deep as the volcanic springs that run beneath the stone. And as the darkness becomes perfectly uniform, and the final ripple disappears from the surface of the pool, what if the peace you have been searching for across the frozen landscapes was never a place you had to reach, but simply the softness that remains when you finally stop fighting the winter